We'll focus on Revit heavily, but we'll also look at Dynamo and Grasshopper today. So who are Bimbeats? Adam Sheether, who, if you're in Brisbane, you would probably know Adam, particularly if you're familiar with the AEC industry and technology. Adam's done a lot of work in this space and is a software developer himself. He's worked for large engineering organizations, and he runs Automation, which is a consulting business that helps large architectural practices and engineering practices scale innovation, essentially. And between Adam and Conrad Soban in the US, they founded Bimbeats in 2019. And if you use Dynamo, you would obviously use the Archilab package, which Conrad is the creator of. And that package, along with some of these other packages, have now been downloaded by 500,000 people. So it's pretty incredible the influence these guys have had. And then, as Scott mentioned, I was a Bimbeats client when I was at BVN. So I implemented Bimbeats at BVN, and then I joined Bimbeats in 2021. So what are the problems that we're trying to solve at Bimbeats, or at least some of the bigger ones? I think everybody can probably relate to these if you work in engineering and architectural practices. Fees are getting tighter. We need to understand where there's duplication of effort. We need to understand how to scale pockets of innovation. Staff wellbeing and retention. Obviously, there's a lot of people leaving companies and moving on. So how do you retain good people? How do you give them meaningful work? And how do you check that they're okay in a digital world where we're not always working in the office? Managing CapEx and OpEx spend for IT. How much are you spending on hardware? Is it providing you with the results that you're expecting? And similarly with your software, how are your licenses being utilized? And then obviously the big one, Revit productivity. Like if you're in an architectural or engineering practice, it's highly likely you're spending many, many hours in Revit. And we want to make sure that we use the data we're capturing within Bimbeats to identify what is good practice, quantify what good practice is, and then train people what that good practice is. So some of the key features of Bimbeats, it's not just model data, it's model data and user data. It's duration metrics, so we capture how long it takes to open files, how long it takes to synchronize files, how long it takes to run scripts, how long you're in a view, how long you're in a sheet. So there's a lot of duration metrics as well as the model and user data, and it's all in real time. So we capture all of this data in real time with no detrimental effect to the user. The user does not know that we're capturing this data. There's no downtime or there's no lag at all in the applications that we're running when we capture this. And it's fully scalable. So Scott mentioned this when we were at BVM before we had Bimbeats. We would have Dynamo scripts that would extract a lot of this data, but we would only do it on select projects at select times, maybe once a week, maybe once a fortnight. Bimbeats captures all of the data on all of the projects in real time. So what is the technology that Bimbeats is built on? So we use what's called the Elastic Stack, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but essentially Elastic is the database, and we primarily use their cloud database to store the data. Logstash processes some of the information that we send to that cloud database. So for example, a Revit journal file gets processed via Logstash before it gets sent to Elastic. And then Kibana is our visualization engine. So Kibana is like Power BI. So if you're familiar with Power BI, Kibana is the equivalent of that. So who uses this technology? These companies obviously are a lot bigger than Bimbeats, and they capture a lot more information than Bimbeats does. So we obviously were pretty confident that using this technology was good for our solution, because companies like Netflix are processing servers and the information on servers on the fly, and obviously they can't have Netflix going down on you. So we were pretty confident that it wouldn't impact the CAD and BIM applications. Some of our current customers, we're a startup, we're a small business, but we're scaling rapidly. And in the last year, we've acquired some pretty big clients, which is great for us. A lot of these clients had built internal tools that they're now using Bimbeats instead of those tools. So that's been really good. And obviously having BVN on board from the start was really good to understand how to tailor the product. So what have we learned in the last 3 years? Well, our biggest lesson is that we thought doing the first bit was probably enough, and that was capture all the information. All of the clients will work out what to do with it. They'll work out what the insights are. They'll work out how to action those insights. They'll regularly review those insights, and they'll continuously improve on it. And that was a big mistake, because it doesn't work like that. The early adopters and the innovators will take a product and will tweak it and tinker with it and get those actionable insights. But the vast majority of people just want a plug and play solution, like when you download an app, that you know exactly how to use it without being told how to use it. So this presentation is really about what we've learned in the last 3 years and where we're going with our dashboards. So most people who use Bimbeats will have never seen these dashboards before because we've been working on these in the last 2 or 3 months. And the idea behind these dashboards is really to go through that continuous improvement life cycle of identifying the problems, planning how to fix them, executing on fixing them, and reviewing them. So once you've put the system in place, you're checking to make sure that that's continuously improving. And we've broken that down into 3 topics of projects, people, and productivity. And the idea is that you start with an overview and you drill down into the problem. So when we first launched the dashboards, we just launched all of the dashboards. There was nearly 200 dashboards, and it was really hard for people to navigate their way through those dashboards. So we've learned from that, and we're trying to develop the user experience so that it's much more easier and much more intuitive to work through. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through projects, people, and productivity. And we're going to start with identifying what are the first things that we need to do within the organization to focus on the biggest problems that we have. So we're going to start with the priority projects. And when we flick to the priority projects, we're now looking at Revit. So we're looking at the amount of time that is spent opening and saving Revit files, the file size, and how many warnings are in those files. So these are key indicators to the projects that you would want to tailor. So you can go, okay, what are the projects that are taking the longest to open and the longest to sync? What are the ones that are the biggest file size? And what are the ones that have the most warnings in? And when we break down the data that we're capturing from Bimbeats, we've worked out that if you reduce your file size by 1%, you reduce your opening time by 1% and your sync time by 0.8%. So we now have quantifiable metrics, what difference it makes when you reduce your file size. So most BIM managers would say, obviously you want a smaller file size, it's going to perform better. But now we have quantifiable metrics to say, when you reduce your file size by X amount, this is how much across your entire business you're going to save in terms of hours of opening and syncing alone. So once we've gone from that priority projects and we've identified the key projects we want to drill down into, we can go into what we call the traffic light dashboard. Now the traffic light dashboard extends beyond just that warning and file size and starts capturing all of the things that contribute to slow performance within Revit. So again, a good BIM manager will know most of these things are things that you want to keep down. So the way that Bimbeats works is that we can tailor these color codes to suit however you want to whatever threshold you consider being okay, not great, and we really need to action this. So by looking across every project in this single dashboard, and this gets updated every time someone opens and someone syncs a file. So every time I refresh this dashboard across an entire business, these numbers will be updated. So for example, if we looked at this dashboard, I would look at the second one down. I would say there's 11 people working on that project. It's a pretty big file size. There's quite a few field regions in that project, and there's a lot of views. So there's a few things there straight away that I would go and focus on to go, how do I go in, identify more about those things to be able to reduce those numbers and then be able to track the opening and syncing times after I've made those changes to calculate how much time and money that's going to save. So if we look at, this is live in the dashboards. I've now clicked on the priority projects and it's going to take me to that first dashboard that we looked at. I'm now going to target that top project because that's the one that's most time has been spent in it. And I'm going to say, now take me to the traffic light metrics on that project. I'm going to, first of all, I've just highlighted it on that screen to start with. I've now gone to the priority metrics of that one project. So that one project now has all of the files associated to it and all of the detail that you would want to drill down into. So once you've gone and drilled down, or once you've got the traffic light metrics, you can then start focusing on some of the things that are really easy, quick wins to reduce the amount of time that you're spending on opening and syncing to reduce file size. So if we look at one of those key projects, we can come in and we can go, right, which team members are compacting that file on sync and which ones are not, and which files are being compacted on SICK and which ones are not. And when you do that across the entire business on every single Revit file, we can see that on average, you reduce your file size by, in this case, 8%. So if you can identify the files that aren't being compacted, you can quickly see that you can reduce that file size very quickly by just having a regular compaction. Now, BVN have got a great example of this in that they have a remote machine that they've set up, and it compacts their central files regularly overnight in the middle of the night, so it doesn't impact on anyone's day job, and they're getting that regular benefit of reducing the file sizes across their projects. So that's a really easy way to reduce the file size of your projects. So this is looking at so this is across all of the projects to get an idea of how much time you've saved. Then if you drill down into a particular project that you wanted to focus on, you can now look at it at a project level and your priority projects. So this particular project had been synced 301 times when it wasn't compacted and twice when it was, and the file size has come down 20% on average. So it's just another example of just a simple best practice metric that when done regularly saves a lot of time, and obviously the file size comes down. Views. So there's a lot of things within a view, very, very simple checks that you can do to save time. One is the view clipped? So if you have an unlimited clip depth, that basically slows Revit down. And it's highly unlikely you'll need an unlimited clip depth. So this is saying that 50% of the views on across this organization do not have the clip plane clipped. Then you can go across the screen and look at it. Has the view got a template on it? And is that view on a sheet? So how many of your views are being placed on sheets that don't have a company template on them? Does that mean that the company template needs updating because the company template doesn't work and that user's having to manually manipulate the view to be able to get it onto the sheet? Or does it mean that they don't know how to use the view template? Has it got analytical categories? Analytical categories typically don't need to be on in most view templates, and it just slows things down. So again, if you go across this screen, you can do some very simple checks to be able to go and look at every project, every file, and understand how you can quickly audit these views to, again, speed up your files. So this is across all projects, and then this is drilling down on a single key project to understand, okay, is there a BIM manager on that project that I can talk to that we can work through these things on? Views not on sheets. As you'll see later on in the presentation, we look at the impact of having views and the number of views on opening and synchronization times. And there'll be some working views that you obviously need to keep. But when you keep generating lots and lots and lots of views that aren't on sheets, it's a really good opportunity to go in and audit those views and clean it up to, again, reduce the number of views, you reduce the number of views, you reduce the amount of time that you're spending opening and syncing files. Largest families. This is a really, really simple one. So you can go from that overview screen down into what are the largest families that have been loaded into a project. Now, we take data very sensitively, and obviously I've had to obscure all of the details across a lot of this, but I couldn't resist leaving that top one in to show that there is a bench chair with 2 plants that is 76 megabytes loaded into a project. Just think about that for a second. 76 meg of a file is taken up by one family that is a bench with some plants on it. It's pretty crazy. But with this, you can go in again and target those key families, clean those families up, save them back into the project, and you're purging your file regularly. And you obviously can use, on the left-hand side, all of the people that have loaded families into the project, the number of times they've loaded in families that exceed a threshold that your company is happy with. So the other thing that I don't talk about in this presentation is we have the ability to set up instant alerts when certain things happen in Revit or Dynamo or Grasshopper. And one of the key ones that we set up is every time a family that is loaded into a project that is over a certain threshold, it will send a Slack message or a Teams message to the head of design technology or the BIM manager on that project to say, go and action this thing now. So it's not like you have to go into this dashboard and keep regularly checking it. You can get notified as and when these things happen, so you can actually action it when it happens. So that was all of the projects, and the worst performing project is here. where you can just go, okay, I'm trying to identify what I need to do to clean up this worst performing project, and I'll go through and I can identify these families in this project. Warnings, and what type of warnings. So obviously warnings are bad. It's very hard to manage all warnings. So with Bimbeats, we have an Excel spreadsheet that basically lists every single warning, and you can set the severity of those warnings to suit what you think are the most critical warnings that you want to deal with. So if you go in and you set the top 10 warnings that typically I worry about are geometry and calculations, but you may say that you don't want duplication of marks or whatever it might be, but you can then go in and target the things that matter the most that impact performance. And again, you can come in here and you drill down by a file name and understand which warnings you're getting across any file and what severity level based on the severity that you set it. And then you can look at across all projects, or you can drill down and look at a particular project and look at when the warnings went up and down. So in here, I would say that when you come in here, there would have been some kind of cleanup of that file, because we've gone from 3,500 warnings down to about 2,000 warnings, or 1,800, because this is the value of what that file is right now. So there would have been some intervention in here, and obviously Bimbeats would be a great opportunity to come in and identify when to do that. And you'd also be able to check on here, what was the average synchronization and opening time up here, and what was it down here? What difference did it make? Because at the same time we're capturing all of this data, we're capturing how long it takes to open and how long it takes to sync on average across that file. So if we look at the live kind of demo of that, moving from the overview to drill down into each one of those key metrics. So we've gone from the priority screen to the synchronization or the compaction on sync. We'll now drill down into looking at the views audit checklist, identifying those that have got clipped views, templates or sheets that have got views on that don't have a template. And then we can look at which views in that project are not on sheets. Then we move across and look at the families and identify which families are the ones that we want to go and address. And then lastly with the warnings. So the biggest difference between what you're seeing now to what we did with our original dashboards were all of this data was available, all of those dashboards were available, but we didn't create that journey of understanding where to focus your time and where to drill down into the priorities across every file across the business. So the other thing that we do, and this comes into that last component of the continuous improvement, is once you've intervened and you've made those changes, to monitor those changes over time to make sure that you're still on track and that when you have made those changes that it's made a difference. So in this one, what we're going to do is we're going to look at any one of these key metrics, the trending data over time. So when did that, or was there a period of time where that spiked up or spiked down? So again, taking the filled regions example, if we drill down into that, here are the custom actions that we can go from that priority screen to look at any of these metrics, the trending of that metric. Did it get better? Did it get worse? So in this particular example, we move from the metric, the priority metric traffic light dashboard, and we drill down into the filled regions. Now in here, over the last 90 days, those filled regions on that project have hovered around the same number. They're still just around 9,000. But the beauty of Bimbeats, because it's all time-based, is that we can come in and go, well, okay, nothing's changed in the last 90 days. I'm going to quickly change that to be the last year. So if I then go and change from 90 days to a year, I can then identify these areas where it went from 2,000 to 5,500 and from 5,500 to nearly 9,000. Now, having that data and knowing that that intervention could have been made back in May, obviously is going to save a lot of time if we could have identified it back then and intervened back then rather than looking at it right now. And then with filled regions, we're now looking at this at a project level. So this is identifying key projects and how many filled regions are within those projects. And on the right-hand side, we have how many team members are working on that project at that time or during that period. So what we can do now from a knowledge sharing perspective and an upskilling perspective is to go from the project to look at which users were creating field regions. So at the moment, we've not identified which users are creating the field regions, but when we move from here, we can then look at, on a particular project, how many interactions were made by which users across all of these metrics. So field region is in here along with many other metrics that you would want to keep an eye on. So again, if we look at that from a workflow point of view and a user experience, we can come in, we drill down into the project that we want to identify. We then move to the trending metric of field regions. We're now in that field regions metric. 90 days isn't long enough, so we'll go and increase that to a year, and then we'll drill down into that period. So once we've drilled down into that period, we know that one of those users has been responsible for the increase from 5,000 to 9,000, and we can then drill down by user to identify a training opportunity for someone that might not know there's a better way than continuously using field regions. And again, this isn't to beat someone over the head with a stick to say you shouldn't do that. It's about a conversation, because none of this is black and white. There may well be reasons why people are doing what they're doing. And it isn't, hey, every time you create a field region, I'm going to stop you doing it. It's a conversation. And that communication piece is really, really important. The worst thing that you can do is keep slapping people over the wrist saying you're not doing the right thing, you're not doing the right thing. This is about identifying training opportunities. And at the end of the day, these best practices, if we can train everybody to use them and follow them, they're going to reduce the amount of time they're spending doing their job, and they get more time back. So that's the aim of what we're trying to do here. So if we go back to the original overview of what we capture for projects, what I've ticked there are the things that we have looked at today, and then some of the things that we haven't had a chance to look at. So again, just the breadth of what we're capturing, just kind of showing you what we've looked at today and some other stuff that we're capturing. Okay, so now if we drill down into people, so we've gone from projects into people. The annotate part in here is where we navigated from the project to the field regions, and then went from the field regions to understanding the user activity of field regions by moving into that annotate deep dive. So that's how we're navigating between projects and people. So this is what we call the wellness dashboard. And this dashboard, I think, is probably the most powerful dashboard we have. And it was a dashboard I never thought would get as much use as it does. And the main reason that it's getting so much use is because since COVID occurred and people are working in a hybrid situation, it's really hard to find when people are working excessively long hours and help them out. So what this does, it's basically grabbing the journal file in Revit. It's looking at every single action that's being performed in Revit, and it's just timelining that into hour periods so that you can identify, as a business, are you working constantly long hours? Are you constantly working on the weekend? And from an individual, is it the same individual? Is it the same project team? Is it the same office? Is it the same project? And get trends around where long hours are occurring. How can we prevent that from occurring by either upskilling the individual or getting extra help on that project if it's a project-based problem? So what we see here is this would be the weekend in the middle. And I actually took this screen grab literally just before I came here. So this was like Wednesday lunch, Tuesday, Monday, this is the weekend. Now, ADG engineers who we do a lot of work with, they send this to their HR department every week, and their HR department just look at this and just give it a sanity check and identify key individuals or key projects where they can tap the project manager on the shoulder so they can have a discussion around the individual or the project to be able to either resource it properly or provide that training, which is really good, because what we've found is generally people are working longer hours now than they did pre-COVID. So this is a great opportunity to identify what they're doing and finding out if there's manual tasks that they're doing that we could automate, or if there already is a manual automation for a manual task. So on the left-hand side, it's a list of all of the users and the number of actions they've performed. Now, again, this is just an indication of intensity. If you're hitting the nudge key 1,000,000 times, like, yes, that's intense, but you're probably not working that productively. So it's just an indication of the number of actions performed. But that overview is really clear to understand where you've got people working long hours and where you've got people working on the weekend. So when you do identify any of those areas that you want to look into even more, you can then start looking at what are the tasks that are being carried out by those users over that period. Now, no surprise, the most common command in Revit is the cancel button, the escape button, right? So right at the top, there's a high lot of intensity around people just hitting escape. Now, I haven't filtered any of this at all, but you could say, well, that's not useful. I don't need to see that. And you can filter that out from the list of actions that you want to look at. And you could just have a list of the actions that you want to monitor. But it's kind of interesting to see how many people keep hitting escape. Similarly with nudging. I always like seeing how many people do nudging. But from here, you can now go, okay, what are the tasks that people are carrying out to be able to identify ways of automating some of those tasks. So now if we look at a key individual within the original or identifying people who are working on the weekend or long hours, we can now filter by that individual to look at exactly what that individual was doing. And again, with the idea here that you can look at what they're doing, hopefully offer an alternative or better way of doing it, or identify things that people continuously keep doing that are manual tasks that you could potentially automate. So if we look at that again from the UX, I can come in and go, right, I want to understand what activity was done on the weekend by that user. So I've now filtered just by that user, and I've now gone in and filtered by what activity they were carrying out. So it's overview the entire business, everybody that's within that business, identify who's working on the weekend, pick out an individual, find out what they're doing. And if you have multiple individuals working over the weekend, you could identify, is that the same project? Is it the same office? Is it the same project manager? All of those types of useful insights that either mean that you've got to provide some additional resourcing on that project, or it's a training opportunity. All right, people and best practice counts. I guess these are kind of like competency dashboards in that you can identify who are the users within your business that regularly do the commands that you would like to see happen frequently. Keyboard shortcuts, it's a no-brainer. Keyboard shortcuts are just way quicker than the ribbon. So these users that are regularly using keyboard shortcuts are obviously onto a winner in terms of time saving. Closing inactive views. It's a really, really easy one, but the more views that you keep building up in the background, again, the longer it's going to take to regenerate graphics and the negative performance that you're going to have within Revit if you don't regularly do that. So to see high numbers in closed inactive views, again, to me indicates somebody that knows what they're doing, and the rest speak for themselves. But you can add in whatever you consider an action to be a best practice action, and you can start building these competency dashboards around who are the users that you would want to pair with a novice who doesn't do all these things, so on the job you can transfer those skills. So if I filter out keyboard shortcuts, because obviously keyboard shortcuts was taking up most real estate on that screen, if I filter out that, we can start looking again at a look at who's doing close inactive views most frequently, because on this dashboard it's going to filter it by the biggest number of keyboard shortcuts, but I can remove keyboard shortcuts to now look at inactive views, and I can progress across here to identify which users are doing which of these tasks. And then look at that, any one particular, and look at that trending over any particular time. So if you ran a training session to say, hey, nice and easy one, guys, just make sure you close inactive views, you can look at that timestamp across the week and you can see, hopefully, that you'll see an increase of the frequency that closing inactive views is occurring over a period of time. Okay, so again, looking at the user experience and the way that we navigate through this, I've just clicked on keyboard shortcuts to say I don't want that to be part of this data set. I now want to filter on close inactive views. I then say, okay, I now want to just look at close inactive views and which users are doing it. And now I want to extend that from 90 days to a year to look at that trending over time. And obviously at Christmas, I think nobody was working, which is awesome. Okay, some quick wins. How many people open every single work set when they open the model? That work set ratio is indicating that those people always open every single work set, which means they're opening every single link model. Whereas if you put all your link models on separate work sets and only open up the models that you need to open, you will save a significant amount of time opening your file. Average time between syncs. 2.29 days, probably not regular enough. So we'd probably want to just have a chat with that person. However, when you click on that team member's name, you'll see how many commands that they've executed during that time too. So it's probably likely that they've just had Revit open and they've gone off and fed the cat, walked the dog, whatever they've done. So you can identify, well, were they actually active or were they just in Revit? Median number of open views. So this is that closing active views. How many views are always open? Like, what is the average amount of views that that person has open in the last 90 days? 14 open views is bad. Like, just hit closing active views and you'll speed up your time. And keyboard shortcuts. But what's really good about this dashboard is now we're looking at that average opening time and average synchronization time. So that average open time is across the entire business. So, and same with the synchronization. But now when you drill down into people that are not performing regularly best practice, you will see that those numbers are going to jump up, because you'll see the difference between the people that are performing the best practice most regularly, that their opening and synchronization times are going to be less. There's a lot of other things that go on behind that. So on average, it will always be less if you follow these best practices. BIM Manager watch its. This is a good one. So all of these commands are things that I would always be very, very wary of. Again, there may be reasons why you do it, but it's good to know who is making temporary hidden elements permanent, who's importing CAD, who's exploding CAD, who's overriding elements, all of the above. Now, again, we're just pulling this from the journal file, so you can pull in whatever you want to pull in. But again, this is all about training opportunities and identifying best practice, pairing someone who is really good at doing these things, or not these things, but doing best practice on a regular basis with someone who needs some help potentially with these things. So we can, again, drill down into any one of these in particular. So now we've drilled down into that temporary hide make permanent, and we can understand who's doing that command on a regular basis. So again, it's a point of discussion that you would want to have a chat to these people around what's the reason that you're doing that. Is it because the view template's not doing what you want it to do? Like, understanding the reason for doing it. Okay, so with the learning opportunities, extending the watch its, we have the selective commands, traffic light metrics. So again, some of these things are repeated on the last one, but what we can do with this is we can say, okay, what do we give as a threshold that is, again, green, yellow, or red with each one of these things across any team member, across any period of time. So looking at this is across the entire business again, not drilling down to an individual, but looking at how often those individuals are performing those tasks, and then being able to drill down into an individual and getting that quick overview as to how many times they do those things. So again, it takes some interpretation or analysis, but if you see it all green, that's generally good. If it's all red, it's generally bad. So again, coming back to this knowledge transfer, if you look at the advanced commands, these are commands that I would typically only really want someone who really knows how to use Revit to be doing these commands, because there's significant detrimental effect on some of these things if you don't do them correctly. So again, people that are performing these tasks regularly, you would hope are the advanced users, but if you find a novice in here that's doing these things regularly, you probably want to identify who those people are and make sure they're trained to be able to use these tools correctly. So if we drill down in particular, BIM Manager's worst nightmare, a member of the team going in and publishing coordinates, resetting coordinates, acquiring coordinates, specifying coordinates without really understanding what they're doing, moving the building, and then documents not coordinating. So here's a quick example of navigating that to understand the journey or the story behind that knowledge transfer. So it's going from who are performing those commands, what's the command we want to look at in detail, and then breaking that down into further deep dive. Okay, people. So we've gone through all of the things there that we've ticked in green, and we didn't get through some of the other things on there. Productivity. Here's where the Dynamo and Grasshopper stuff comes in. Yay, computational design. So if we look at Dynamo across the entire organization, we can look at what are the top 20 Dynamo projects, what are the top Dynamo scripts, and what are the top users. So this is who are the people within your business and the projects within your business that are regularly running Dynamo scripts, and what are those scripts. So here's your overview. How frequently they're being used by how many people. We can then drill down into a particular tool, and we can then start looking at how stable those scripts are. What's the minimum time it took to run that script, and what's the average time it took to run that script? And was that script run from Dynamo, or was it run from Dynamo Player? And how many times did it fail? So this is a really, really good example, and this is an ADG example where they identified that they were moving information from analysis into documentation for PT and duplicating this effort time and time and time again, and it was taking on average 8 hours to do that task each time. They automated that task, they made it into a Dynamo script, they ran training sessions, they put it into Dynamo Player. Now every time someone needs to move information from the analysis to the documentation, they run the Dynamo script. However, they can now identify, is it worth going in and optimizing that script? Because yes, they've gone from 8 hours to 5 minutes, but if it's being run many, many, many times, which it is, they might want to go in and identify whether there's opportunities to optimize that even further, or identify if it's failing, because 4 times is pretty good. That's in a year. So it's only failed 4 times, which is great. So if we look at the script execution as a whole across all the scripts, here's the opportunity to go in and identify which are your scripts that are performing the worst, and be able to go in and optimize those scripts to clean them up based on how often they're being run and the average time that they're taking to run. And again, this is looking across the entire organization. So the strategy here with ADG is that they've got about 10 people that go in and either build the scripts or modify the scripts, but everyone else that interacts with those scripts, they run them in Dynamo Player because they don't need the complexity of opening Dynamo, they just run them in Player. So in here, you can see a list of all of the people that just use Dynamo Player and the frequency that these people use Dynamo versus Dynamo Player across all of the files. And again, from a stability point of view, we're now looking at how many times each of those files have failed over the year. Script builders. So this is giving an indication of, again, linked to this in terms of the people that are actually in Dynamo rather than Dynamo Player, which files are being worked on and what activity is happening, who's connecting up nodes, who's adding nodes, who's removing nodes, to just give an idea of the intensity of the work that's being done for building those scripts. And then in the bottom right here, again, just an intensity level of the sum of the time taken to run those scripts by a user. So you get a really good idea of who's using Dynamo most frequently. And again, the number of builder actions. So a builder action being, I'm adding a connector, I'm adding a node, I'm removing a node. So you can get a good idea of the people that are really in here on a regular basis and those that may be just modifying scripts. Productivity and the Dynamo uptake. This is a really interesting graph actually, because on the left-hand side, we're seeing by week, which users are running how many unique scripts. So it's, if we go on the far left, it's obviously quite a few users running multiple scripts, and then it seems to be declining as we go across the year. So, and this obviously is the same indication of that, this time a year ago, there were 22 unique Dynamo users that month, but it's dropped off. Now I looked at this morning because I printed this off this morning, and I'm like, I'm trying to understand what's happening here, because we encourage the use of computational design and we're increasing all of the use of these scripts, or it looks like it is. But the reason that this has declined is because ADG have now realized that what they want to do is move the Dynamo scripts into a Revit toolbar, and they're running them as C# plugins. So they're moving their Dynamo scripts now into the toolbar because it's even easier and even quicker to run. So they're actually reducing the amount of time that people are spending in Dynamo because they're now using the inbuilt plugin instead. When we look at the breakdown of which packages are being used, we can look at both the core packages and custom packages. So again, from a training perspective, within your business, what are the nodes that are most commonly used? So if you're going to train someone, this is obviously a good indication of where you would want to train in terms of understanding of which particular nodes within it, which package. And similarly for the core nodes, we have that for custom nodes. So no surprise, Conrad's going to be happy. Archilab is the #1 package that people are using, which is good news. But again, we're now looking at this from a custom package point of view rather than the core package. And this will help manage packages within your organization to understand which ones that you would need on everyone's machine and how frequently you need to update those packages. So if we drill down into any one of those, we're now drilling down into the Archilab package. And we've said in the last year, there's 33 unique nodes that have been used from that package by these many builders, and over time, how many people were using that package. So again, looking at this from a UX perspective, we can just drill down and say, right, I'm interested in who's using Archilab, come into the Archilab package, and then go into a deep dive to go which nodes from that package have been used by whom and how often. Grasshopper. So very, very similar to the Dynamo workflow. We've got the same workflow for Grasshopper. So what are your top 20 Rhino files that the scripts are being run on? What are your top 20 Grasshopper scripts? Who are your top 20 Grasshopper users? And at the bottom, how frequently they're using them. Now, evidently, there is a super Grasshopper at this organization indicated by this bar. And I'm surprised if he does anything else but Grasshopper because he's a very, very busy man or lady. So we'll remove him. So this is the overall organization, but he's obviously skewing this data. So by clicking on that user and removing that user, I can now get a better picture of that organization when I remove the young Grasshopper. So now again, it's getting a good indication of which scripts are being used, by whom, how frequently. Similarly with stability and execution, we can look at how long those scripts are taken to run. And again, look at where there's errors in those scripts. So this is going to tell me the name of the file, the name of the script, how many errors or evaluation of the warnings and errors, and what were those error messages to be able to understand how do we fix that script. So this one is just drilling down into understanding a particular script and what it failed for. So this is some honeybee analysis on Apartment Sun. So it's saying that there is an exception because an exception for the room. But again, you can start drilling down and understanding if there's regular scripts that are being run, are they having any errors, and go and fix them up. So this one is probably my favorite slide of this talk, because we've seen a massive uptake of people using Grasshopper across a lot of the architectural practices we work with. And this is just evidence of that similar to when we looked at the Dynamo uptake, this is an organization, and I'll give them a shout out, Nettleton Tribe. So NT, this is their use of Grasshopper over the last 9 months. So they started using Bimbeats back in February. And if we look at the uptake, it's quite clear that they've had some intervention there to encourage people to use more Grasshopper scripts and Grasshopper workflows. And we can show that when I drill down and understand what's happening over time. So if we look at that and I say, well, okay, go to the start of the year, they had 10 users with 23 Rhino files. I'll now go back to the last year. I'll drill down into the last 3 months instead of the last 6 months. And you can see that, yeah, there's 25 users now and there was 10 users before. So this is really awesome to see that uptake of computational design across the entire business. Same thing with packages. There's a summary of obviously every single package that's been used. What are the most popular packages? What are the unique components within each of those packages? Looks like there's a lot of Rhino Inside work being done here with the Revit package within Grasshopper. So that's interesting. And again, the uptake of Rhino Inside is something we're finding with a lot of organizations getting a lot of value over out of using that tool. Productivity component deep dive, so similar to what we did before, we're now looking at the Ladybug package and how often the Ladybug package nodes are being used and across which users. So this is great to see. Again, there's 5 individual users using that package within NT. So again, we can do a drill down into this and we can select any package we want to do that in-depth analysis to understand where do we want to focus our time on the most productive tools and training. Productivity, we're getting there, we're nearly there. So we're going to touch on going back to Revit now, some of the things that there's a perception of whether they do or whether they don't affect downtime. So what we're going to look at are the file size and opening times, syncing times, and times that Revit's been open. So we've got the file name on the left, we've got the username next to that, and it's going to give you a list of the longest average time or the median time to open, the longest median time to sync, the ratio of opening to syncing, and the maximum session time. And then down the bottom, it's going to be split up by file size. So we're looking at this impact of file size on opening time. So if we go on the very far left, we're seeing between 0 and 100 meg where the most files are. And then it goes down as you get into the gigabyte of file size. But when we look at that in terms of opening time, you can clearly see that when you go from obviously a 100 meg file to a gigabyte file, there is this incline on the median time that it takes to open that file in the same way that it is for the synchronization time. But what's interesting with this dashboard is that you can look and understand who's regularly opening files and not regularly syncing, or this interaction between what is the best method of opening and syncing, and obviously on the far right, maximum session time, 2.5 weeks. Having Revit open, probably not a good thing. Should probably close it down. And Autodesk recommends you should actually close Revit down twice a day, or at least once a day. So at lunchtime, close it down. So there's some really good, easy wins on here where these people just need to shut Revit down and restart it. So we can drill down again by an individual project here, or an individual file, and look at one of the worst performing files and what the median time is to open that file, and the total time that's taken to open that file, and the median time to sync and the total time to sync. So now we're drilling down into at file level and user level of understanding downtime on opening and syncing. So we're pulling out a lot of analysis on what are the things that affect file size and affect synchronization and opening times. So I've just pulled out 3 here, but there's a lot more in our dashboards. But this is the effect of the number of warnings and file size on opening and synchronization times. So I've split this into what I call small files up to 250 meg, 250 to 500, 500 to 750, 750 to a gig, and then anything that's in excess of a gig. And you can see pretty quickly that obviously you want to reduce your warnings, you want to reduce your file size. Looking at how we want to audit views and reduce the number of views, quite clearly here we can see that the time it takes to open and sync a file is highly dependent on the number of views and the file size. So again, it's just reinforcing that message of reduce unwanted views and keep your file size down. Okay, so we didn't have time to cover Revit add-ins and some other stuff that needs to be converted into the new dashboards. But I want to finish, or I want to talk about BIM 360 versus the network. So what's really interesting here is that some companies are performing really well in BIM 360 and some people are not. So what we have here is on the left-hand side, an opening comparison of network central files versus BIM 360 files, and a sync comparison with the same thing, network files versus BIM 360 files. And it's broken up in those same bands, 0 to 250, 250 to 500, 500 to 750, 750 to a gig, and greater than a gig. Now, with company A, across all files, the average open time is a minute, and they've had 3,366 of those. The average time in BIM 360 is 2 minutes, and they've had nearly 6,000 of those. In the sync comparison, the average sync on the network is 23 seconds, and the average sync on BIM 360 is 27 seconds. And there's the number of records to get that median. Now, if I click on this, we now can look at certain file sizes. So if we now look at file sizes between 250 and 500, what is the relationship? So we're now at 2 minutes and 3 minutes, 36 seconds, 33 seconds. We're now going to look at large files. Let's look at anything between 750 and a gig. We've now moved to 3 minutes and 2 minutes, and 19 seconds and 45 seconds. Now this might be because there's not that many files and not that much work being done in those areas within that business. But what's interesting is when we go to company B and we look at exactly the same information, there's a much bigger difference between the network and BIM 360 within this organization. So when we go to the 250 to 500 meg, we're at 2 minutes and 5 minutes and 33 seconds and 56 seconds, I think it was. And when we go to large file sizes between 750 and a gig, we now go to 5 minutes to 12 minutes to open that central file. So what Bimbeats is highlighting here is that there is no, is the network better than BIM 360, because there's so many other factors coming into play here, but highly likely that people that are working from home on their own internet connection that are connecting into BIM 360 are having an irregular performance compared to someone who's connecting to BIM 360 on the company network. Just as a very simple thing to check, what's your internet connection at home compared to what it is in the office. Lastly, and this is probably one of the key insights from Bimbeats, but it takes the longest to gain a good understanding, but there's a lot of value in this. So what this is showing is the duration of time spent across different view types within your business across any time period. So the way ADG used this was they identified the area of post-tensioning and reinforcement, and that's how they found out about how much time they were spending manually detailing reinforcement and detailing post-tensioning to be able to identify that automation. So in here, they had a massive percentage of their time on reinforcement plans, and that was how they, over time, worked out that that was where they were spending the most time and what to automate. But as an organization, you can look at where you're spending your time, on what projects, and at what period of time during that project. Is it when you're entering DD that you spend most time in GA plans? Is it when you're just about to go to construction that you're doing, or you're detailing? How much time are you spending in typical details and general notes? How much of that is duplicated effort across all of your business? So the beauty about this dashboard in our most recent version of Bimbeats is that we've now added a document changed to duration ratio field. Now what this means is that we're not just tracking the amount of time that's been spent in each view, we're calculating how many changes were made in that view. So you can say, well, I need to have it to a certain ratio for what I call active work. So if someone's got a view open and they've made 5 changes in 3 hours, you don't want that time to be attributed to that project because it's not really active time. So you can say, I want at least X amount of hours per, or sorry, X amount of changes per hour, and put a ratio of the document change to time ratio to get active time, not just Revit is open and a view is open. And again, this is drilling down into this into general arrangement plans. And the UX for this, again, coming in and now going, okay, I'm now going to focus just on general arrangement plans. Which projects, where did I have spikes? How much time did I spend on those projects, and which users were working on those projects? So on the far left are the file names or the project names, and on the far left and on the far right are users. So you can understand who's spending time in which projects over which time period on any project. So breaking that down even further, you can then start looking at how much time is spent in views and sheets by each user. So over any given period of time, how much time is spent in there. And when we talk about 3 days, that's 3 24-hour days, not 3 8-hour days. So you can start identifying what are the views that people are spending the longest in. And again, using the typical details example, who's spending time in typical details across multiple projects and combining that into a central file and taking that time out. So again, looking at that from all projects, and the graph on the right is terribly scary and you'd never try to analyze that. But when you do break it down into a project and all of the files on that project, you can then get an understanding of which team members are spending which time in each of those files. And then drilling that down even further by looking at what are the names of each of those views and the time that is spent in each of those views. So that's it. That's Bimbeats in a nutshell. And yeah, the journey that we've been on in the last year is that capturing the data, we achieved that by capturing it all in real time and having it fully scalable. But the journey of understanding what to do with the data was the thing that we've been working really hard on in the last year. So thank you for your time, and any questions? Yeah, so we capture the file type, so we know whether it's a local file, a family, a detached file, a network file, or a BIM 360 file. So we break it down by where it's capturing the file from. So all of the capture is, it's an add-in that's in Revit that's capturing the Revit events. So that's capturing whether it's coming from BIM 360 or the network or your local file. We have another plugin which captures the admin portal of the BIM 360 web portal. So we track what's happening in the web portal, but that's separate to what's happening within Revit. So if you go into the web portal and you add people and you remove people and you add projects and you remove projects, we capture that separately to what we call the Revit event data, which is an open, a sync, a save, a view, a sheet. Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think with what I've shown on some of these, like, it's a good indication of the actual time spent, but it's not directly billable, obviously. And you've got to look at these times and validate it. But it's much better to have this as well as a human going, well, what did I do? Oh, 8 hours on that, 8 hours on that, 8 hours on that. So what we do, there's a couple of things that I didn't show. We integrate with Deltek Vision. So if anyone that uses Deltek Vision for their finance, the job number in Deltek Vision will match with the job number in the Revit project as an example, and you can combine the two to look at those two together. So you can pull the duration metrics out of that and look at it by project and then compare it to what you're billing as an example. And another feature that I didn't show that we have is called Active Window. So what Active Window does, it's taking a grab of your screen every minute and it just records the title of what you're on. So that will tell you what application you're in from a licensing point of view. So if you're in a web-based application, it will tell you how many users are spending what time in web-based applications, but it's also a timesheet as well. I do my timesheet by looking at that at the end of each week and break up how much time was I in Slack, how much time was I in Teams, how much time was I in Google. Yeah, so because it's literally just taking a snip, and it's not a snip of your screen, it takes the title of the active window every minute, so that at the end of each week you break it down however you want to break it down to look at where you spent your time. So obviously what we covered here was primarily Revit and Dynamo and Grasshopper, but that goes across every single application. And the other thing that we didn't touch on is that we run something called Metricbeat, and Metricbeat captures what the computer's doing. So we know every application that's running on the machine, how many licenses are being used across every piece of software, not just the CAD and BIM tools. So the Adobe Suite, Bluebeam, SketchUp, all of those types of things. So that's coming from Metricbeat, which is capturing what the computer's doing. So when Revit crashes, as an example, we capture what the CPU was doing, what the memory was doing, how long the computer's been up for, how long Revit's been up for, and all of the metrics that are associated to the computer as well. So when you buy Bimbeats, you buy the software, which is an installer for Logstash. So if on those three things were Elastic, Logstash, and Kibana. Elastic is the database. Logstash is a processor, because if we send the journal file to Elastic, it's like, don't know what to do with it. So we process that in something called Logstash. So within your company, you would have a Logstash server that processes the log files. So that sits within your organization. It can be a virtual machine, but then that sends the information to Elastic, which is the database, and Kibana is the user interface. So that's what you're seeing here. That's Kibana. Yeah, so it's a really good question. So when you buy Bimbeats, we get paid for the software. You store your data in your own cloud if you want to, and you pay for the running costs of storing the data in your Elastic database. We can store it for you, we can manage it for you, but one of the things that always gets asked about Bimbeats is like this data capture, security. So we always give the opportunity for a client to host it themselves and only give us access to it if they want us to have access. We don't see anyone's data unless they share it with us. So you would be responsible for the Elastic costs of running that database in the cloud. So if you are working on projects that don't have data sovereignty issues, we set our instances up in the US because it doesn't take any longer to process the data and it's cheaper. But if you need the data to stay in this country, then you set your instance up in this country. And BVM work on a lot of defence projects, and they've cleared it for all of their security issues. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. Obviously not install it on the machines of the people that are working on those projects. The other way you can do it isn't that it doesn't capture it, it will still capture it, but you can have one space which is a secure space which only X amount of people can access, and then everyone else accesses a different space. So you could set up a space that says all of these projects are confidential, they're only being able to be accessed by these people, whereas everyone else can access these other projects. Yeah, so again, like obviously only had an hour, we have a feature called Snapshot. So Snapshot is a deep dive into every parameter of every category in the model. Now we don't capture that in real time because it just bloats the database. Like if you got a record of every time a column was deleted, added, modified, like it would just blow the database. But if you wanted to track, okay, what was the grade of the concrete last week to this week or over milestones, we have something called Snapshot, and it goes in and does a deep dive of whatever categories you want and whatever parameters you want. So we have one client, a government client, that just wants to make sure that they have the parameter that they need in all of their categories filled out. So it's just like we grab the category, we grab the parameter, and is it filled out, is it not? But you can go as deep as you want and as frequent as you want, but it's captured statically, not in real time, because it's just too much data to do it in real time. Yeah, so with project information parameters within Revit, you can add whichever parameters you want to be able to then filter by those parameters. So I think NT have a market sector. Do you have market sector in which is like commercial, residential, or was it office? I think we were talking about doing it. So if it's a parameter within the file, you can then filter by it. So if you have phase of DD, 70% DD, 80% DD, whatever it is, you can then track those files based on that parameter and just get the data back from the files that have that parameter and look at the time that was spent when that phase was 70% DD, how much time was spent when it was 80% DD. So you can add in whichever project information parameters that you want. So you could say, if you're in multiple offices, this is a Brisbane project and you have a Brisbane parameter, and then you'd have a Sydney parameter or a Melbourne parameter, and then you can group all your Melbourne projects with your Sydney projects and compare across different offices. Yep. In I think in my built presentation, which is probably online, I gave an example where ADG were extracting material quantities across key elements because on a particular project, when the contractor was on board, they changed the columns from in situ to precast. So they pulled out all of the material volumes to then track, these were the hours we spent on the variation because we had to change from in situ to concrete, in situ to precast. But you could pull all of the embodied carbon values out of all of those materials as well, and then have a benchmark project of what is your carbon footprint and what is your target, and measure that over time. Like, what materials do you want to be using? Which ones do you want to be using less of? Do you want to be putting pulverized fuel ash into your concrete to reduce, like whatever those things are? If it's a parameter within Revit, it can get captured and it can get modeled and analyzed. Yeah. We've heard it a few times before. There are a few things. So we measure how much content is 2D work versus 3D work. So we can't say this 3D model doesn't match the 2D, but what we can do, and what, again, I think we did with Nettleton's, was look at 1:100 GA plans when they're just about to go for construction and go, we shouldn't really have that much 2D work on here. Because it's going out for construction, the drawing should match the 3D and we shouldn't have 2D over the top of it. So you can do those types of things, but there's no smart, does the 2D match the 3D yet? Feature request. Yep. Well, so I think with the trending ones, I would say you would set up a regular report that would just get emailed to you once a week, once a month, whatever you want that frequency to be, because you're looking at it over time. You're not looking at a static snapshot. Whereas the alerts are, this thing has just happened, I want to know this thing, and it's an isolated thing that you're capturing. It's not in context to anything. So I think one of the best alerts, and the alerts can be set up on whatever you want it to be set up as. When we were at AU, we have a whole lot of out-the-box ones that we set up. Someone at AU came up to me and said, the best thing that we've got out of Bimbeats is I'm in IT, and since everyone moved to BIM 360, their C drives are filling up because collaboration cache is filling up, and they set up a threshold where as soon as the C drive on any machine got over 80%, they went in and cleaned up the collaboration cache so that they could never get to a point where they couldn't open a model. And I was like, that's gold. And we didn't have that one, but that was something that was built by a client, which was really useful. But coming back to your original question, I think from a trending point of view, I'd set up a weekly report that would just publish that dashboard to whatever group that you could just look at. Is it better? Is it worse? Because it's over time, not a static capture. And I'll give another shout out to Mitch and the guys at Nettleton. So they've integrated it with Airtable, and they're pulling in metrics from loads of sources, and they're pulling in the Bimbeats data as well as well, you can explain it better than me, Mitch. But basically they're combining all of this data into a single area where on a Monday morning they go through projects, and Bimbeats is one component of many things because they've pulled the Bimbeats data into Airtable. You can embed it into a Teams channel as an example. So ADG have all of their BIM technicians, their Teams channel has their dashboards embedded into them, and they can tailor that to, is it certain projects where because obviously they don't want all of the information to be shared by everybody, but you could embed it, you can capture it and embed it wherever you want to embed it. And then you still need to provide access to the data, obviously, because you need access to be able to get in, but you can embed it in Teams or wherever you want to embed it, and integrate it into Power BI as well. So if you're not familiar with using Kibana, you can, and we have a series of dashboards that we do a REST call into our database, and we pull it down into Power BI. So BVN have got maybe a dozen Power BI dashboards that they use because that's what they were familiar with, and they weren't familiar with Kibana to start with. Now Lens works very, very similarly to Power BI, and it's like drop and drag of fields. You literally drop and drag the field, and it's pretty intuitive.